The question that we're going to be looking at today's lunch bar is up here, and it's, why have his followers caused so much harm? So why have Christians caused so much harm? And that's what Michael will be tackling in just a minute. If you have questions throughout Michael's talk, we have a phone which you can text, so the number's up on the screen in the corner. Text your questions throughout, and Michael will answer some of those questions, and there'll be a bit of a chance for some discussion and things like that later on after he's spoken. I think is that everything? Cool. So please welcome Michael and enjoy.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Welcome back if you've been here already this week. Welcome for the first time if you haven't. Do enjoy the pizzas, and we'll bring some more around if there is any left with the question time in 20 minutes. So do text in your questions. We will do with as many of the questions as we can and finish on time, hopefully, as well, so you'll be able to get away if you need to. But we're looking at this huge question about basically the record of religion through history. Why have the followers of God caused so much harm? Hasn't religion been responsible for violence? And many people have been very quick to assert this. Gore Vidal, the American author, says more people have been killed in the name of Jesus Christ than anyone else in all of history. Or look at someone like the late Christopher Hitchens, who said, religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. So the whole idea of religion is just, he says, a very negative thing. We don't need it, we shouldn't have it. Or Oscar Wilde, to pick a different character. When I think of all the harm the Bible has done, I despair of ever writing anything equal to it. Or listen more fluently, as it were, to Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. He takes off John Lennon's song, he says this: imagine with John Lennon a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts and no gunpowder plots. No Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, no Serb-Croat Muslim massacres, no persecution of the Jews as Christ killers, no shiny bouffant-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people of their money because God wants you to give until it hurts. Imagine no Taliban to blow up ancient statues or public beheadings of blasphemers, no flogging of female skin for the crime of showing just an inch of it. And Dawkins' arguments, and the argument... sorry. You got training? Thank you. I ate a piece of pizza before and it's halfway down my throat. Good, that'll wash the pineapple down. Dawkins' argument is basically saying, if you get rid of religion, the world will be a much better place. Religion has just been responsible for so much violence. And yet it's not simply an argument of the new atheists. Actually, many people through history have made this observation. Go back a few hundred years to Pascal, and he said this: men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. So this has been quite a historic accusation against religion and Christianity. But I guess it's been more prevalent and more common to assert this ever since 9/11, when we saw the implications that religious fundamentalist belief can have in a very obvious way and rather too close to home in the West, not just in some distant parts of the world. And so it's made many people ask the question, if we got rid of religion, surely the world would be a better place? Well, as we start to look at this, maybe just 3 observations to make at the beginning. Firstly, I want to ask this question: is religion the root of all evil? That was the name of a Channel 4 series that Richard Dawkins hosted a number of years ago to coincide with the release of his book. And his suggestion, quite provocatively in the title, was that it was. But actually, I would suggest that a level and objective observation of history might be quite different. When I was studying for my GCSEs, I remember I was probably a bit of an annoying 15-year-old, and this would be an example why. I remember chatting to my friend about God once, and my maths teacher overheard me. And he said to me, half the wars in the world are caused by religion, I'm going to have nothing to do with it. And because I was a rather cheeky 15-year-old, I said, and half the wars in the world are caused by money, I presume you're going to have nothing to do with that either. Now, it didn't particularly work, he just told me to shut up and get back on with my work. But actually, religion is not the only thing that could cause war. Money has caused war as well. And actually, if you're going to be brutally honest and look at the last century, much of the conflicts of the last century wasn't inspired by regimes that were religious, but actually those which were atheistic. I have friends, good friends in Romania, some of which were imprisoned and persecuted precisely because they were Christian in such cultures. So to say religion is the root of all evil, I would suggest, is overstepping the mark somewhat. Although religion obviously has been the cause of evil, I wouldn't want to deny that. Another problem that we make on this is that we can fail to differentiate between religions, as if all religion and all religious belief is equally bad and equally dangerous. But actually, the reality is, I'm not sure many of us lay awake last night worrying about the Amish, okay? Or whether they're going to, start to cause a global, threat of violence. There are different religious beliefs and different, consequences to them. And so rather than just lumping all religion together, it would be worth differentiating between them. And I guess related to that as well, I want to ask this question: what is religion anyway? How would you define religion? Is it belief in God? Well, I guess that would be kind of obvious. Apart from various forms of Buddhism don't believe in God, so we can't really say that. And actually, when you start to think about it, it's very difficult to say what is a religion and what is not a religion. Is it a philosophy? Well, you can have philosophies that aren't particularly religious. And what I would suggest actually is that any worldview or philosophy, not just ones that we would say are traditionally religious, but any philosophy has the potential to be used for violence. And when we reject God, we can actually transcendentalise the alternatives. Very interesting in the, I don't know if you watched Les Miserables. One of the interesting things about the French Revolution was this seeking to overthrow the aristocracy and the religious aristocracy in France. And later on, there was a lady that was being executed, about to be killed by the guillotine. And she mocks this idea of liberty, which had become the kind of almost the kind of quasi-divine thing in France at the time. And she said, "Liberty, what crimes have been committed in thy name?" See, they got rid of one thing, but they replaced it with something else that was also open to abuse, as it became absolutized in that kind of culture. So what is religion? It's not so simple, is it, when you start to think about it? So the reality is that anything, any worldview and any philosophy can cause violence. And many worldviews historically, sadly, have. And so the question that we need to ask is this: when a philosophy, a religion or a worldview leads to violence, is that a consistent outworking of the beliefs of that idea, or an inconsistent one? Has it logically flowed from the beliefs, or is it actually quite a contradiction of the very thing that they claim to believe? And that's what we should do with any belief system. Now, this week has been organised by the Christian Union. I am a Christian, and so I'm not here to seek to defend every religious belief in the world. Where will we stop? But I am here as a Christian, and I would want to say, for the next few minutes, I want to look particularly at the claim that Christianity has caused violence down through history. And when Christianity has been used to support and defend violence in its name, is that a consistent or an inconsistent outworking of it? Let me try and give you an illustration. It might be a silly illustration, but let's give it a go. You've all heard of Band Queen, okay? Imagine, they're not obviously in existence anymore, so what you get, instead of Queens, you get tribute bands, okay? You might have been to hear one once. But imagine there are some guys, Dan and the guys that have been organising this week of events. They decide next week, well, the events week is finished, we've got nothing to do. Let's form a Queen tribute band. So Dan gets some of his friends together, and they get round and they have a practice for about 5 minutes. And they say, we're going to be a Queen tribute band. And they advertise all round the Union and down Oxford Road that they're going to have Queen tribute band that's going to be in here, Jabez Clegg, next week, Wednesday evening. Now, most of us who have any knowledge of Dan and the other guys' musical ability know that actually 8 PM Jabez Clegg next Wednesday is probably a place to avoid, right? But just happens that next week a group of Mongolian exchange students come to the University of Manchester, and they're wandering down Oxford Road and they're given this flyer. It says Queen tribute bands, Wednesday 8 PM. And they think to themselves, Queen, we've never heard of Queen, maybe it's the Queen. We'll go along and have a look, or maybe it's a band, we'll see. So they turn up, and they actually happen to be the only members of the audience here next Wednesday night, because everyone else has steered clear and gone to something else. But the Mongolian students come, and Dan and his mates get up with their guitars and their drums, and they start to do a version of Bohemian Rhapsody. And about 5 minutes later, the Mongolian students are seen running down Oxford Road as fast as they can, saying, "Queen are the worst band in the world." Now, are they right or are they wrong? I guess it partly depends on your view of Queen. But actually, given the experience that they've had, you could say, well, they're probably right, aren't they? Their experience has been pretty negative, and you can't blame them for coming to that conclusion. But actually, what they've seen is a very bad representation of the original thing. And I would have to say that down through history, there have been very bad representatives, I think, and we'll see why in a moment, of Jesus Christ and his claims and teaching. And if your experience has just been of that, then I can fully understand why you wouldn't really want anything to do with religion, in particular Jesus Christ. Historically, you might look at things like the Crusades or the Inquisitions. More currently, you might have had other experiences of Christians. We thought about some of them in the last lunch bar. But experiences that say, because of what I have seen and experienced of religion, I don't want anything to do with it. And in one sense, I can say, I can fully understand that, given some of the experiences you might have had. But what I would say is I think that what we've seen through history is there have often been very bad representations of what Jesus Christ is all about. I mean, take for instance the Crusades. And actually, it's very fascinating to read about the Crusades. I really recommend, if you're interested in that, read a book called For the Glory of God by Rodney Stark, a social historian, who looks in context at a lot of these things that we're looking at from an historical point of view. But take, for instance, the Crusades, the idea that we should reclaim the Holy Land, a political and geographical piece of land for Jesus. What was the problem with that? Actually, the problem is, if you start to study and look at the teaching of Jesus, nowhere in the teaching of Jesus do you get any indication that Jesus is establishing a political kingdom. He didn't come to overthrow the Romans. And in fact, he is put on trial for the very thing that people hate about religion today, that it's seeking to establish, political unrest. Jesus is put on trial for that. And he says, under oath, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, my followers would have fought." In fact, when one of his followers did try to defend him with a sword, Jesus condemned him and told him to put it away. See, Jesus said, that's not my kind of kingdom. And it's not based on having a certain geographical place. So there was an encounter that Jesus had with a Samaritan woman, and she was from a different ethnic and religious background, and she said to Jesus, "Well, look, you worship in this place, we worship in this place, where should we worship?" And Jesus said, actually, it's not about the place that you worship at all, but it's about the person that you worship. And it's about your hearts. So actually, you don't need to live in a certain part of the world or own a certain building to connect to God, because Jesus says ultimately it comes through him. So often people have misunderstood the nature of Jesus and his kingdom, misunderstanding it for some kind of political system, which it never has been and never should have been. So some people have done that, and I would suggest when people have misunderstood it, they have often been bad representatives. But is that all? Well, let's go back to our Mongolians for a minute. Imagine you bump into them running down Oxford Road next Wednesday night saying, "Queen of the worst band I've ever heard in the world." Now, what could you say to them? Well, you could potentially find out that there is another tribute band playing, a better tribute band playing, across town in some pub. And you could say to them, "Hey, you've had a really bad representation, but can I take you to a better one? Can I take you to listen to something much better?" And possibly, if they're very gracious, they might just come with you and give it a second shot. Now again, we've said that sometimes in history we've seen bad representatives of Jesus Christ. But actually, I would also suggest that through history, if we're going to be fair, we have to say there have also been much better ones. People who have, I think, more consistently followed Jesus and his teaching. And I think one of the big mistakes often, particularly people like Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, is that they're very selective in their reading of history and only talk about the harm that Christianity has done and fail to see any of the good that it's done. And actually, you cannot understand or begin to understand the history of our country, this country, unless you understand something of the influence of Christianity upon it. Why are many hospitals and schools called Saint something or other? Well, because they were started by Christians. was a Christian that sought to abolish child labour. It was a Christian William Wilberforce that sought to abolish slavery in Parliament. It's a Christian Martin Luther King in America that sought to stand against racism. Christianity through history has had a big historical influence. And to fail to see that, I think, is rather naive. And it happens on a kind of grassroots level as well. I've got a friend who lives in China, and a few years ago, might be 4 or 5 years ago now, there was a terrible earthquake in the Chengdu region of China. And there was an appeal for help, people to come and help in the process of cleaning up and trying to rescue those that were still caught under the rubble. And 500,000 people from across China volunteered to come and help. And 50% of them were Christians. Although in China, the percentage of Christians in the general population were much less than 5 probably. And so it's interesting that actually Christians have often sought in different ways to help, motivated by their belief in Jesus. And to fail to see that would be a mistake. But I can't be too hard on all atheists, because not all atheists do miss that. Matthew Parris, for instance, is an atheist columnist in the Times, and he wrote this very insightfully recently about his upbringing as a youngster in Malawi in Africa. He said, "Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. I used to avoid this truth by applauding, as you can, the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation is part of the package. But Christians, black and white, working in Africa, do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write, and only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say the world will be better without it." And I have to say, well done Matthew Parris for actually being honest enough to admit that. I guess my question, if I ever got to meet him, would be, can he see the difference that it can make not just in Africa, but also in Britain? Because Christianity can make a very real difference, not just in the practical work that it does, he says, but also in the transformation that Jesus can bring as well in people's lives. So don't just see the bad representatives, also check out the good representatives. But I guess one of the questions is, well, how do you know whether they're bad or good representatives? How do you know whether they're being consistent or not? Let's go back to the Mongolians for one more time. Imagine we were the Mongolians, you've taken them across town and they've seen this tribute band and they come out and they're like, well, that was a good one, that was a bad one. How would they know what Queen were really like? And of course the answer is, you could just get them a CD. Or if they've got an iPod in Mongolia, you could download it onto their iPod. They could listen to the real thing. And then they could work out for themselves which was the good representative and which was the bad. And if you want to assess Christianity through history, you really need to assess it in comparison with its founder and see who is being consistent and who is not. And I think one of the fascinating things when you look at Jesus is just to see how radical he is on this. That nowhere does Jesus support or condone religious violence. But actually on many occasions he says quite the opposite. Let me just give you a few examples. There's one occasion where Jesus and his followers are going through Samaria. We've already mentioned a different ethnic religious area. And the people in that part of the world disagreed with Jesus, they didn't accept him or follow him. And so some of Jesus' followers came up with an idea. They said, Jesus, shall we call down thunderbolts from heaven and destroy them? You know, they don't believe in you, let's get rid of them, blow them up. And Jesus says, great idea. But no, actually doesn't. He actually rebukes them because they've completely misunderstood what he's about. He's not come to blow up his enemies, he's come to die for them. He teaches the most radical teaching in the world. He says, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. It's natural to love your neighbours. Jesus said, love your enemies. And did he just say it? Well, actually, no, he was utterly consistent and he practiced it too. So at the end of Jesus' life, as he's being crucified on a cross, for no crime that he's committed, a complete injustice, he says to the very people, and about the very people that are crucifying him, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He shows forgiveness, not contempt, to the people that do that, his enemies. And so my question is, if that is what Jesus is like, someone who teaches that you love your enemies and then consistently lives like that, what would a consistent outworking of that look like? See, it's very interesting. You know, how did William Wilberforce stand against slavery? Did he say to people, because there were many people at the time who claimed to be Christians, who claimed that, slavery was okay. Did he say, guys, you're taking Christianity too seriously. Stop believing the Bible, stop taking it so seriously, and then we'll get rid of slavery? No, actually he said, no, you're not taking Christianity seriously enough. If you really understood the very concept that humans are created in the image of God with dignity and value, how could you treat people like this? Or Martin Luther King, did he say to the Christians in America that were supporting racism, guys, you're taking Christianity too seriously, stop being so consistent? No. He says quite the opposite, stop being so inconsistent. How could a follower of Jesus, and the Jesus that we find in the Bible, support something like that? The call is to greater consistency and not less. To follow it more closely and not more loosely. That's the answer. So I guess maybe you might be asking the question, well, what is therefore the root of all evil? If Christianity and religion per se is not the root of all evil, what is? Well, I think it's this. Well, actually, no, I don't. I'm sorry, that's just a joke. Is it Burger King? No, it's not. But I was in Burger King recently and they helped me as I was thinking about this. I don't know if you've seen their advertising slogan, have it your way. I was in there eating my bacon cheeseburger and I was reading this. This was on my mat as I was so shocked by it, I photographed it. It said this: have it your way. You have the right to have exactly what you want, exactly when you want it. Because on the menu of life, you are today's special, and tomorrow's, and the day after that. And well, you get the drift. Yes, that's right. We may be the king, but you, my friends, are the almighty ruler. I don't know what you think about that. Do you like it? I almost choked on my bacon when I saw that. Because I thought, actually, that's the problem, isn't it? The problem in the world is not per se religion, but actually the fact that, in a sense, each one of us wants to be our own almighty ruler. And what happens when I live my life saying, I want to live my life my way, and have my own way? Well, what do I do when I come into conflict with someone else who's saying the same? And my way conflicts with their way? We fight it out. Now, if I'm a political leader or someone with authority and power, I might fight it out with a war. But I'm not, so I could just fight it out with my words and my actions. But actually, we don't just see conflict on a global scale, do we? We find it on a very personal level. And actually, Jesus himself said the root of evil is actually the human heart. He said, listen, he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. He's saying the problem of the world is not establishments or structures, but actually every human heart, mine included. And the conflict that I find there. And Jesus says the problem is we can live life with me at the centre, trampling over those that get in the way. And Jesus says there needs to be a radical reorientation of my priorities. And so the Bible says in Jesus we have someone who not only was willing to take my place in the forgiveness for all of the ways that I've done that, the ways that I've hurt others, but also I find in Jesus someone who's able to start to transform me. So I stop thinking so much about myself and I start thinking more about others. And that should be the mark of someone who's come to receive the forgiveness of Jesus. That their reorientation has taken place. They're starting to care more about others and less about themselves. There's also a beautiful picture in the Old Testament of the future. In Isaiah the prophets, we have this prophecy of what the world will one day look like when Jesus comes again. It says this. The language is slightly old-fashioned, but the picture is beautiful. It says, He, God, will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's this beautiful picture that one day there will be an end to conflicts and violence. That one day the instruments of destruction will become instruments of production. It's a beautiful picture, and Jesus says that's what he's doing. He's changing hearts now, and one day he'll change the world to be a place without violence and conflicts. And that those who follow him and know him should be seeking to increase and do that now as well. It's a beautiful picture. So, what do you make of this? We'll get to questions in a moment. Might be that you're saying, well look, I'm still not convinced at all. That's fair enough. I'm not naive to think that maybe in 20 minutes you'd all necessarily have all your questions answered. So, my encouragement to you would be to take away that book, the Uncover book that's on your chairs or your tables, and investigate for yourself. The only way you can evaluate Christianity through history is in comparison with its founder. So, have you ever taken time to look at Jesus for yourself? And one of the primary documents, and see what Jesus is like. You may find it surprising. I would suggest, I think you probably will find it surprising, because Jesus is so different to our expectations of what we think he would be like. So as a reasoning, thinking adult, take away the book and have a read. It might be that you're curious though, and you're saying, look, I would like to find out more of the difference that Jesus can make and what he is like. And well, why not, as well as taking away the book and having a read, come to a course that's also called Uncover. It's going to start next week. It's going to run for 6 weeks, be about an hour or so in length. It'll meet, I think, in a coffee shop. It'll be very relaxed. We won't sing, we won't pray. We'll just look at Luke's Gospel, an account of the life of Jesus, and investigate and ask questions. And even if you're still a skeptic in regards to these things, I would really encourage you to come along with your questions and investigate for yourself and make up your own minds. I think so often we've made up our mind judging on our experience of a few RE lessons in the media. Well, check out Jesus for yourself. It's going to be much more helpful, I think. And of course, come back to the other events that we've got going on through the week. Well, we'll have questions now. And as we just start the questions, let me just say, in your books there should be a little card, which is a feedback card. We've got 10 minutes or so for the questions. So while we do the questions, it'd be really helpful if you could just fill it out. There'll be a box at the door that you can put it in as you leave. On the back there's comments, and you can leave any comments you like, and everyone can do that, whether you've been before or not, and whether you want to leave your details or not. And on the front there's a little box that says, tell me more. Now if you want to find out more about that course called Uncover, and when and where it will be, then tick that box and leave your details, and pop it in the box, the feedback box, that's being wonderfully displayed to us by the door, and as you leave in 10 minutes time, okay? So do fill it out now while we have the questions, so that you're ready to drop it and go if you do have to rush off. And also just to say, there's a bookstall, and there's a whole number of books on there that deal with a number of these issues. One of them is a book that I wrote called What Kind of God?, which looks at this issue and 9 others. So if you've got more questions, and I'm sure many of you do, have a look. And if you're not part of the Christian Union, you can have them at the specially subsidised rate of £1 each. So do have a look at that. If you're thinking of leaving the Christian Union to get a cheap book, don't. But if you're not, then we would love to give them to you at that. Do we have the questions? Great, we'll jump straight into those. Okay. Do you want to come up here and read them into the microphone?
Yeah. Okay, first question. As the Bible is so open to interpretation, how is it possible to guess what is a good or bad representative of Christianity? Each person can twist any quote to suit their agenda. How do we know which is right to follow?
Okay, really good point. There's a story of a guy who was like, I don't know what the Bible's saying, let's work out. So he opened it at random and he put his finger on the page and said, Judas went out and hung himself. He thought, I don't like the sound of that. So he opened up the Bible again and he put his finger at random on the page and it said, go and do likewise. And he thought, I don't like the sound of that. So he opened up the Bible again and put his finger on the page and it said, whatever you do, do quickly. Now obviously, if you take verses out of context, you can make the Bible say whatever you like. So how do you understand it? Well, the normal way you understand the book is by reading it, line by line, sentence by sentence, and looking at what precedes and follows each sentence. It's kind of fairly simple. Probably shouldn't have to teach a Manchester student to do that. And I would say the same is true with the Bible. You need to understand it in the context of not only the paragraph in which it comes, but the book in which it's written, and also the flow of the Bible itself. So for instance, I wouldn't take a verse in the Old Testament book of Leviticus and directly apply it to my situation now. The context of that book was for a particular people, the nation of Israel, at a particular time in history. Now it can tell me things that I think are helpful, but I don't directly draw that and say, therefore I must follow that law. Okay, we need to understand it in context. When I look at the New Testament in particular, and I look at Jesus' teaching to his followers, I think that does more directly apply to me, because I am as a Christian following Jesus. So I think to understand the Bible, we need to understand it in the context of the book and the whole library of books in which it comes. Do you need an expert to do that for you? Actually, I would suggest no, because actually you can do it for yourself. That's why we give you those Luke's Gospels and we say, look, read it for yourself. If you think I've just been selectively editing, come back and tell me, okay? And let's look at it together. So do look into it yourself. I'm not trying to say that I'm just the experts here and you're just the dummy who investigates. Okay. Have we got lots of questions?
We've got a few, but some of them are on the same.
Okay. Does anyone want to come back briefly on that one before we go on to the next one? So I'll just we've got 10 minutes basically, so I want to utilise the time well. Okay, we'll go on to the next one while we have time.
Okay, there's kind of three that ask the same kind of thing, so I'll read them all out. How can a God of love advocate genocide, e.g. in the Old Testament? How can you justify being against slavery if Jesus supported not just slavery but also beating slaves, as said in parts of the New Testament? And you say that Jesus/God does not condone violence, but what about the punishments for breaking the Ten Commandments listed in the Old Testament, many of which are death?
Wow, okay, 3 big questions. Are you okay if I just try and tackle those? We haven't got loads of time, but I'll try and do my best. If we don't do it satisfactorily, we will try and be happy to chat about it afterwards. I think I'll take them in reverse order, because I think the first one's probably the hardest one. So we'll finish there. Is that okay? It might take the longest to deal with. Just bear with me. They're very good questions. Thank you. Firstly, how do we make sense of the punishments in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and things like that? How does that fit with the God of love? We will deal with this a little bit on Friday when we look at the idea of justice. The first thing I would say is we are not part of the Old Testament nation of Israel, so we don't directly apply the laws that we find in Leviticus in the Old Testament to our culture today. So I'm not saying that the punishments that are outlined there, therefore, should be necessarily part of our legal system today. Okay? That's not saying that they were wrong, I'm just saying they were in a different context. But obviously they're there and they were instituted by God, so I can't just avoid the issue. So I think what I would say when it comes to this issue is this. There is violence caused by religion in the sense of, you perpetrate violence against those who don't believe in you or whatever. But there's also, in any culture, a system of justice, which actually we would say is a good thing, that actually evil should be punished. And I would say there is a difference in the Old Testament saying that God instigates a standard of justice and says actually that punishments that crimes should be punished, as it were. And we would do that in our society as well. Now, Jesus in the New Testament says to individuals, we are to turn the other cheek. It's the responsibility of the state to bring about justice and to punish crime. It's the responsibility of the individual to turn the other cheek. So it's not a contradiction here, it's 2 different things. That would be the first thing I'd say. The difference there, I think there is the sense of justice and how do you operate as a nation state in that particular climate. There may be other questions on that, I admit, we'll chat more later. Secondly, what about slavery? Doesn't Jesus condone slavery? It's often said that because Jesus didn't stand up against slavery and the New Testament didn't seek to reject slavery, that therefore the New Testament supports implicitly slavery. It's again a big area to look at, but let me just say a couple of things in regard to this. Firstly, when you understand slavery in the 1st century Roman world, and slavery as we most commonly think about it, the African slave trade 200 years ago, we are talking about 2 things that are very, very different. So, slave trade in the Roman world, in some situations, was almost a form of kind of social security in a state that didn't have social security. You would sell yourself to be a slave in the sense that you would get provided for, you would have a place to live, food to eat and such like. And so slavery in its best form, and it was of course open to abuse, but in its best form could be a way of some kind of social security to provide care for people that wouldn't have done. It wasn't a great one, but I'm saying there is a difference here. And why doesn't Jesus, well, I would say firstly, I don't think Jesus condones it. Obviously the New Testament does give instructions on how you should treat your slaves. So you think, well, doesn't that mean it condones slavery? Well, it's very interesting. In the Roman Empire, if you just sent a slave away, well, firstly, in a place without any social security, that could be worse for the slave, because they have no one to look after them. What are they going to do? They've got no family, whatever. And secondly, in that situation, if you just sent someone away, you could sell them to someone else, but a slave who just leaves their slave owner was liable to be killed. So actually it would have been worse for the slave in that situation. So the New Testament says, look, don't you can't release your slave, but treat them well, treat them rightly, and honour God in the way that you treat your slave if you are a slave owner. Okay? And the other thing I'd say is, in the Roman Empire, in the first century, Christianity had no position or ability to challenge the legal system. They didn't live in a democracy like we do. It wasn't as simple as petitioning Parliament or signing up on the internet saying, we don't like slavery. Now, it wasn't going to get very far, okay, for a Christian movement that was a minority movement at that time. And what you do see, and I think it's, again, read Rodney Stark's social historian study on the early church, is the radical difference that Christianity gives in terms of its treatment of the slaves, of women and the poor. And he wasn't a Christian when he wrote it, but he said one thing, or the three things, that really led to the growth of Christianity was its treatment of people in this area. Not that they abolished slavery, but the way they treated people of different classes was radically different. And so at the end of Romans, you have Paul writing to a group of people, some of them that would have been aristocracy, important, some of them that were slaves, but all together in the church, considered on the same level. It's a very different nature on that one. Sorry, did you want to come back on that one before we go to the next one?
Yeah,
sorry.
there was a direct quote in the Bible that Jesus said, if you keep your slaves, then
where does it say that?
Luke 12:47.
I'll look at it later if you want, sorry. Or you can, if you turn it up, is that all right? I'll answer the second question, or the third question, as it were, the one about religious violence, firstly. What do we say about religious violence? In terms of wars and genocide in the Old Testament, I think it obviously is a difficult issue. We tried to cover this in brief the other day. And it's not something I find easy. It's not that I read the Old Testament and I say, oh, this is all lovely. No, actually, when you think about it, a lot of it is quite shocking, because our world is actually a pretty messed up place, isn't it? There's a lot of rubbish stuff. Firstly, of course, the Bible doesn't always prescribe what it describes. So some of the violence in the Old Testament wasn't commanded by God, and we need to distinguish between that. But of course some of it was. The conquest of Canaan and the Canaanites in the Exodus, clearly you can't get away from that. So what is going on there? Just a few things to bear in mind. Okay? Firstly, I wouldn't strictly say that what's going on is ethnic cleansing in this situation, because what God says is happening is actually a judgment against evil practices in those nations. We often think the Canaanites were just a lovely group of people that were happily worshipping their lumps of gold and silver. But actually the gods of the Canaanite religions, gods like Molech, were gods that people sacrificed their children to. So these were particularly evil nations. And God says, actually, if people have come to that point, there is ultimately a day of reckoning and a day of justice. Now, he didn't just do it instantaneously. We're told that for 400 years, God warns those nations and says, look, if you don't turn back to me, then there is going to be a day of judgment to come. And we do have instances of individuals and sometimes nations and cities that do, and they are spared the judgment that is threatened. But it's also worth saying that God doesn't just pick on the other nations, but when Israel themselves reject God and turn away from him, they too face that justice themselves. And they're conquered by firstly the Assyrians in the north, and then the Babylonians that conquer the southern part of the kingdom. They face God's justice for the way that they have become corrupt over time as well. Now, is it that God suddenly became different in the New Testament and he says, look, I'm now a different God? Well, no, I don't think that. And the Bible does say that ultimately there will be a day of justice, and we'll think about that on Friday when we think about the idea of hell and the difficult subject of that. But it does say this. It says that in Jesus we find someone who is willing to take the justice that we do deserve and the punishment we deserve for the way that we have, often in different ways, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, cause real hurt and pain to God's good world. And Jesus was willing to take that so that we don't have to. And so I think I need to understand the Bible in context. Again, it's really important to say I'm not part of an Old Testament nation of Israel. I'm a follower of Jesus. So I also need to understand the flow of the Bible. Jesus didn't come at the beginning, he came at the end. I follow him. I seek to live with him at the centre. Now that doesn't necessarily make it easy, I admit that. And it might be that we still have big questions and issues in regard to that. But I think once you start to put it in context, it does help to make sense. Just one other thing I would throw out, and may be helpful. I was talking to someone the other day and it said, it just seems so wrong. Couldn't God have thought of a better way of doing it? And I said, imagine a country completely ruled by the Taliban. Okay? Absolutely ruled by the Taliban. what do? Do you go in and say, hey guys, stop being so nasty, let's get along and negotiate? Of course you don't. And in fact, what we see in Afghanistan is the ongoing problem of trying to bring about peace and justice in a place where there are people who completely are opposed to it. Now, if you start thinking more Taliban when you think about Canaanites and less, the Welsh or the Scottish, you might actually start to understand a little bit of why it's more complex than we start to think, okay? Again, need to understand that in context. We're over time, sorry. We'll chat about Luke 12 if you want in a moment. If anyone else wants to know about Luke 12, we'll look at it down at the front. But we did promise that we'd finish at 10 to, so if you've got to get away, you can in a moment. So let me just say, before Abby gives some notices, just a reminder, if you want to ask questions, come to the front, talk to me, or chat to those around you. Really happy to do that. But also, obviously, come back to the other events of the week, particularly tonight. We're going to be looking at the whole subject of success. And what does Jesus have to say about that? Each lunchtime, we're looking at some of the big objections to the Christian faith. Each evening, we're looking at some of the existential longings of our culture and looking at what Jesus has to say to that. So come along tonight. Abby will tell you the details of what's going to be going on and a few other things too. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you've enjoyed it. Stay around. Is there more pizza? Yeah, a little bit more pizza. Feel free to eat that. Feedback in the box that Hannah's holding up at the back as well. If you could fill that in, that would be really great. We put on this events week for people who are outside of the Christian Union. So if you have comments, if you have questions, if you have things you think we could do better or other topics you'd like to see us address, things like that, pop them down, put them in the box, and we'll aim to do that as we do more events throughout the year. Just to say that tonight we have another event down in Owens Park. It's at the Source Cafe, which is just across from the reception in Owens Park Halls on the campus. As Michael just said, it's looking at success, uncover success, what will really satisfy. So if you're interested in that, come down. There'll be music, cake, a bit of a talk as well, a bit of drama, things like that. So we'd love to see you there. It's a great venue. We had a great night last night, so yeah, please do come along. Also, before that event, for international students or anybody who's interested, really, they'll be meeting. There'll be an international meal put on, and they are meeting at 6:10. Is it, James? 10 to 6, sorry. James, do you just want to stand up? Are you going to be there?
Yeah.
Okay. James is going to be there at Hardy's Well, meeting people at 10 to 6, and then he will take you down to a house, somebody's house where there's been a meal cooked. Everyone will enjoy that and then go off to the evening event as well, and there'll be a short talk there as well. So yeah, we hope you have enjoyed that. We hope to see you tonight. There's a bookstall, as Michael already said. Books are £1. Come along to tomorrow's lunch bars. The themes are unsure at the moment. Don't have a thing on me. Oh no, hang on. What day is it today? Wednesday. Tomorrow, Thursday, the intolerant God. How can there only be one way to God, and why would he limit my sexuality? So if you're interested in those, please come along tomorrow. Other than that, we hope you have a really great day. Thanks.